Yeah.
he finishes his secondaries end of September, and we
Mm.
had an exchange about the fact that he had finished them. And I said, okay, you can have a minute. And then he said 2 days later, well, my respite was brief because he already was offered an interview within a matter of 2 days.
Unbelievable.
I know.
Unbelievable.
And
Yeah.
again, for our listening audience, this is a little bit of an outlier situation. We like to talk about the outliers because they're interesting, but
Yeah.
for the vast majority of people, this is not how it goes.
This is not real life. I mean,
Right.
yeah.
So again, like a message of optimism, and this makes it interesting listening, but
This
to
is not the norm. And this is why I always talk about luck. So much of this is luck. Who just happens to be there, checking the inbox or like reviewing the applications, and who just happens to click on your application at just the right time. And this is the case for any application process. This is the Oath podcast presented by Med Edits Medical Admissions. You will learn about all things related to being pre-med, the medical school admissions process, and the residency match. I am your host, Dr. Jessica Freedman. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 6th episode of The Oath. Can you believe it, Laurie? We're already on episode number 6.
I'm loving it.
And Laurie and I had such a great time on episode 5 discussing one of our fabulous applicants here at MedEdits. And today we are going to be discussing another applicant, another case study, because we feel that all of you can learn so much by understanding different students' paths to medical school. So I'm first going to present our applicant. Our applicant was a late applicant by anyone's definition, submitted their application on July 31st. Took an early August MCAT. So when they submitted their late application, they didn't even know what their MCAT score was, and went to a top 50 undergraduate college. And one of the questions that we always get is, do I have to go to a top 20, a top 30 medical school? Or I'm sorry, erase that. Do I have to go to a top 20 or a top 30 undergraduate college to be competitive for the most competitive medical schools? So by the time you hear this applicant's entire path and entire story to medical school, you will learn that every student's path is their own path. And this is why guidance for every student is so individualized. So many people probably would have said there was no way this applicant would ever get in, going to a top 50 college, being a late applicant, taking a very late MCAT, being reviewed very late. And by the end, you're going to see sometimes everything turns out just a-okay. So,
Mhm. Yes.
so Laurie, do you want to go ahead and, kind of, we'll just sort of walk through this applicant's application, just like we did last time, just so, listeners can really understand how applications are reviewed and, and how all things are kind of considered and how different people present themselves differently and how it can work. There are many different ways for this to work well.
Yes. Yeah, that sounds great. So when I met this applicant, and thank you so much to this gentleman for letting us use his case study, it's rather fitting because he's very interested in education and medical education. And that was one of the things that really impressed me when I met him. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But yes, there were a few things that were out of his control related to taking the MCAT, and he just really rolled with it. So that
Mm,
was a wonderful quality that he had. And I might attribute that to his many moves as a child. He had lived in both India and in his home state, and I think he just was very adaptable. So when these things were happening, and as we say to our students, life happens, and it's going to keep happening in medical school, and it's going
mhm.
to happen during this application cycle, and you can't get rattled. You can't let it completely deter you. So one other trick of the trade is that when he submitted his AMCAS, knowing it was late, he didn't have a score. So we kind of had a
Uh-huh.
projected score based on
Mhm.
his practice tests, and we
Hmm.
developed a school list around that that we would use, but he only submitted to one school.
Yep.
So he
Great
could,
strategy. Yes.
so that's one of our little tricks of the trade.
Yes.
Um, and then add the rest later, because you can add, once you're verified and you add
Mhm.
schools, it's immediate. There's no lag time there. Um,
The application is
so
sent directly to schools once you're verified as soon as you add them. So let me just kind of clarify that strategy for people. So in order to get verified, the verification process can take several weeks, especially when you're submitting the end of July. It can take many weeks. So our student, interestingly, submitted July 31st, was processed August 17th. That's actually a really fast processing for that late in the cycle. That can often take like 6, even 8 weeks. So once you are verified, once you are processed, then when you add on medical schools, it's immediately transmitted to the schools versus that initial school that you need just to start that verification process. That's the lag. That's the extended time. One other thing, I realize I didn't introduce ourselves because we just assume everybody knows us, but maybe someone's listening for the first time. So my name is Dr. Jessica Freedman. I am the chair and founder of Med Edits Medical Admissions, which I founded 18 years ago. I am a former faculty member at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Laurie was one of my first faculty whom I brought on. We worked together at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, where she was the dean of, my gosh, I'm forgetting your title now. You were in the Office of
assistant.
Student Affairs, Assistant Dean of Student Affairs, on the admissions committee at Sinai, also had worked at Northwestern at UCSF. So Lori and I have been working together a very long time. So that's just a little bit about us. So onward with our student. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, onward with our student. And if this is the first time you've listened to us do a case study, I should say again that we wanted to offer you a message of optimism and a message of individuality that you can do this in your own way,
Mm-hmm.
to an extent.
Yep.
So,
Yep. Absolutely. And we're going to see that. We're going to see that as we go through the student's application, certainly. Yeah.
so, so he gets his MCAT score back, and again, we sort of were gauging how this was likely to go and proceeding with that in mind. And he did very well. He got a 524. So, that's a
Unbelievable.
very, very high score.
Yep.
Um, he was working on his secondaries while he was waiting for that score to come back. He had felt like the test went well. So again,
Mhm.
it's like we're constantly analyzing what's the next move. Do we keep moving forward with this cycle? Do we not? But all signs were pointing to it was a go. And so his secondaries were in by the end of September, which is also,
Wow. That's
you
also
know,
really late.
it's late.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah,
late.
that's late. So, like you talk about, Lori, this student was on a different timeline. When students submit late, when they have phenomenal backgrounds, we'll learn about the student's background in a second, when they have amazing experiences, when they have amazing metrics, those are sort of the only students I think whom we say, okay, you can be like complete at the end of September, beginning of October, and you may still have success, right? So talking
Mhm.
about sort of this individualization in terms of like our overall guidance. Had this student, let's say, went to a top 40 undergraduate college, had a 3.96 BCPM biochem physics math or the science GPA, 3.97 GPA overall, and let's say that student had gotten a 508 or a 509 or even a 510 or 511, then we might have been a little bit more cautious, right? So applying that late, getting all the scores back late. But with a 524, that's putting the student in percentile rank of 100%, literally.
Mhm.
Um, that's pretty exceptional, and he also had the experiences to match that. So
Right. And
yeah.
what was, I think, most striking about this applicant for me is that when I met him,
Hmm.
and he had been a full year out of college when we met and started our
Hmm.
work, and he was working at a very demanding position.
Hmm.
Um, and so he had a full year there in that position, and it was a research coordinator,
Yep.
um, research study coordinator. And he was
Hmm.
planning to continue that for the next year. And this is another kind of interesting point that we are seeing in a trend. A lot
Hmm.
of these research positions, they want a 2-year commitment.
Yes.
Now, that's
Yes.
a whole nother discussion because I think 2 gap years that's a big investment of your time,
Huge investment of your time. Yeah, I
on the
agree with
front
you.
end of this very long educational cycle.
Hmm. Hmm.
But as he was already a year into this position, and this was what he had planned for his
Hmm.
application year, his gap year, um, he just had a maturity and a confidence and a
Hmm.
calmness to him
Hmm.
that I knew would be such an asset. He wasn't getting flummoxed about things, and there was almost no whiff of anxiety in any of our communications, which is pretty
Wow.
remarkable.
That's
Pretty
really
remarkable
remarkable.
for this process.
Mm. And
Go
but I
ahead.
have a question. Do you think that was just sort of part of his character? Like, was that how he was brought up? Is this sort of how he's gone through life? Or do you think it was also, or maybe was it only, that he was so confident because he knew he had such a high level of achievement, and we'll go through the experiences, shortly. Do you think it was just because he was so confident in his abilities, or a combination? What do you think?
I think it was both. So I was thinking about this too. He's the oldest of two boys, and I'm thinking maybe in
Mm-hmm.
his culture, there were certain
Mm-hmm.
expectations, high standards
Mm-hmm.
placed, on him.
Mm-hmm.
And again, just that worldliness, having lived in lots of different places, having
Mm-hmm.
to meet people, make friends. Um, and I'm sure
Mm.
he was getting good reinforcement from mentors and people he was
Yeah.
working with. And again, we bring this up. We don't know what the letter writers are saying. That's the one piece of data we don't have in our case
Mm-hmm.
studies.
Mm-hmm.
And he probably was getting pretty good feedback there too. So I think that
Yep.
contributed to his overall, calm and confident approach to this whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. And certainly, yeah, I think that's important, kind of to mention is how important that feedback is. And, we always sort of try to get a sense of this from our students when we're going through, who's going to be writing your letters of recommendation? What's your relationship with that person? How well do you know that person? Have you ever had coffee with that person? Or, do you just know them from the class where maybe they lectured you, for a semester? So we're always trying to get a sense of those relationships when we're guiding students in terms of their letters of recommendation. And can I dip into his activities now just to talk about this sort of very showcase kind of experience that he had during his gap year?
Oh, yes. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Do you want to talk about the most meaningfuls again?
Yeah, so let's go through his most meaningful. So we already know this student has a very high MCAT, a very high GPA, went to a top 40 under, maybe even top 50. Was it top? I have to look it up. Might have been top 50 technically, if based on US News and World Report rankings. Not that those mean anything, but it's just a way to sort of categorize, like, so you understand where the student is an undergraduate student. And he had committed when he applied, he had already done 2,400 hours at this lab as a research study coordinator. So clinical research, and and he had anticipated hours, another 2,000 anticipated hours. So this student, as one of his most meaningfuls, was applying with a research experience with 4,400 hours of experience. So and I recently went through a lot of data, Lori, and this was not one of the students, whom I reviewed, but I recently went through a lot of data for our students who were successful getting into Harvard Medical School. And one of the things that I found across all of those students, and this is in another episode, or this is in a YouTube video actually, and in an article, which I can link in the show notes, but those students all had exceptionally high numbers of research hours. in a research
Hmm.
position as one of their most meaningfuls. So that was sort of a common thread among all of these students. So something interesting to note as we're reviewing the students' application. And what I also find interesting, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Lori, but the research that he was involved with, postgraduate was focused on neurodegenerative diseases. And I
Yeah,
didn't
very
see
interesting topic.
very interesting topic. And he was a biochem, molecular biology, human physiology major with no minor. And I didn't really see that prior to that, he had had any real experience in sort of neurology and neurodegenerative diseases. Right? Am I wrong about that? Or is that right based on what you know?
Oh gosh, I
I,
think
I, yeah,
I
I'm just
feel like
sifting through.
maybe he sort of was interested in that area. I know he had
Yeah.
done a lot of work at a senior center with Alzheimer's and dementia
Mm,
patients. That
mm,
was another one
okay.
of his most meaningfuls where um, he used one of his favorite things, chess, with these senior
Yes.
citizens. And that's also a really
Yes.
great thing to do is take one of your passions and share it with other people and
Yes.
um,
Yes.
kind of use it
Hmm.
for good.
Yeah, so that was an assisted living facility. I see this. And
Yeah,
let's go back first to this other experience because I also want to talk about that next most meaningful. But
yeah.
there, in other words, I guess what I'm getting at is here's a student who really didn't have a defined interest, like in a big way, in neurology, neuroscience, neurodegenerative disease, but found a great opportunity, right?
Mhm.
And so, sometimes students think that every single thing they do has to be in somehow related to an interest that they've already established. But if you find a great opportunity and you find somebody to mentor you who wants to take you on and embrace you, it's okay to explore a new interest for the purposes of any experience, right? So, not everything has to be sort of carefully lined up and packaged in a candidacy, is what I'm getting at.
Correct. And I think I remember this research just being so incredibly interesting because I think
Mm,
it's something that touches almost everybody because it's related to football players.
mm,
He was CTE research,
mm.
and it was with people who had played football.
Yeah,
And it was just a great project that he
yeah,
had the opportunity to be involved in.
yeah. And former football players. So that's interesting. He must have met some interesting people this way too.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
I mean,
Hmm.
the writing is really pretty heartbreaking, because it's these big, strong former athletes that are really suffering.
Yeah,
And that's what he talked about, just the loss of um, their minds and their bodies. And so,
yeah.
um,
I like to read excerpts.
you do. Do you
So,
have one in
so
mind?
yeah, let me read an excerpt. Sorry, let me read an excerpt. One of our heavily symptomatic former football players, Chad, once recounted how he got lost in his hometown. I still remember his voice faltering, a departure from his jovial tone. A fading memory meant he could no longer work or live independently. I imagined what life would be like if my cognition was compromised and prevented me from becoming a clinician or an educator. So, look how beautifully he does that. He talks about this individual, shows that compassion, shows that empathy through storytelling, yet then connects it in such a subtle way to his own goals, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Like that's great. So there and this is sort of what we talk with our students is there are ways to kind of bring things up when it's not even the primary topic of whatever it is you're writing, right? So that's like,
Mhm.
oh, so right off the bat, the student wants to be a clinician and an educator, right? Because this most meaningful was the first thing in his apple. It was the top because it was the most recent of his most meaningful. So or and of his activities, entries. So I think that's pretty amazing.
It is. Well, and
Yeah.
we'll talk about his next most meaningful. And that was the other really striking and memorable thing for me when I met him was his
Hmm.
interest in education
Yeah.
and being involved in medical education. And I knew
Hmm.
he would be preaching to the choir with his application because those
Hmm.
are the readers of a medical school application. Those are the people that are invested in that mission of the institution.
Yeah.
Um, so his
Yeah.
second meaningful activity, he founded this OChem prep course, like a 6-week free course for his,
Mm,
fellow students, and
mm,
brilliantly studied their progress. So it was kind of like a
mm.
whole thing where he was
Wow.
developing his educational skills, but he was also kind of developing his techniques for studying educational interventions and things like that.
Mm.
So that was a really savvy thing to do.
Wow. And he charged less than $10 a student that the provost enthusiastically agreed to fund the program indefinitely. We have
Mhm.
begun offering prep to undergraduates attending other colleges. Our enrollment is at 600 students. Mm.
Yeah.
And he founded this because he observed how much anxiety surrounded the organic chemistry and sort of how anxiety provoking that was for everybody, right? Orgo is one of those courses. I mean, I
Yes.
remember it still all those years
Yeah.
ago, like Orgo, oh my gosh, and still it still just incites fear in
Mhm.
everybody. And he talks about, a student, who was, very upset. Once a prep student named Mandy came to me on the verge of tears, expressing worries about her chemistry abilities and prospects as a pre-medical student. After listening to her concerns, I shared stories of my own test anxiety and unsuccessful titrations and encouraged her to form a study group. I ended up working with Chloe and the study group every week. As I gave her targeted feedback and helped sharpen her problem solving skills, her confidence grew and her grades improved. I mean, so he was helping students on an individual level. That was his own time. And then, like you said, he had all of these publications in education, right? About
Mhm.
peer teaching.
Right.
And so he
Right.
translated all of this into case studies of his own, it looks like
Mhm.
mostly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, phenomenal. Phenomenal. Yeah.
And then his third most meaningful was, we referenced it earlier,
Hmm.
playing. He would go to a senior center and he played board games, he played chess, he taught chess at the senior center. And I think that just shows such patience, such
Mm.
compassion. I think anytime you work at a senior center or with a
Mm.
geriatric population, it's just a great thing to do because that's who receives medical care. Like they're the
Yeah.
vast majority,
Yeah.
you know, utilizers of medical services. So to have some kind of an experience and a comfort level with that
Mm.
population, I think is really great.
Yeah, agreed. And at the same time, I mean, he's a chess person,
Yes.
right?
Oh,
He'd done
yes.
this since he was little. And he also co-founded a nonprofit at his undergraduate college as well. That was not a most meaningful, but that was 850 hours right there for the nonprofit. And that chess club grew to over 100 members. And so he was taking his interest and then bringing it, to it was a senior center, right? Or it was assisted
Mhm.
living, right? A local assisted living facility. And what's interesting, right, Lori, is that the assisted living facility became one of his most meaningfuls, but he didn't even have 300 hours of time there, but yet it
Exactly.
was
Yeah.
significant. So, when sometimes students think that your most meaningful has to equal the most amount of time devoted, but that isn't necessarily the case. Sometimes
Right.
your most meaningful is the one that is maybe a little bit less time, but was, really significant to you.
Yes. Yes.
So, yeah.
And I think so, you have space for up to 15 experiences that you can talk about. And I would say, just to kind of capture his strengths in these areas, lots of things related to mentoring,
Yeah.
leadership, and education.
Hmm.
So, like,
Hmm.
the activities were kind of all revolving around those areas.
Yep.
Um, and then, as
Yep.
we discussed, obviously, the pretty significant research experience too.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
again, I was just very struck by his interest in education. It
Right.
wasn't just being a TA. Not that that's a good
Yeah.
activity to
Yeah,
have in your
it's a great
application.
activity.
It's a
It's a great
great
activity.
activity, but
Yes.
it's sort of like he went above and beyond
He
with.
went above and beyond and he took it into the community. And, something that you talked about how calm he was throughout this process and, and didn't have sort of the same level of anxiety we see so commonly in our applicants. What I see sort of throughout this entire application is an unbelievable amount of patience. So let me just read one of these, so like, with the student he was very patient with, and let me read an excerpt here from the most meaningful from the assisted living. Zach cannot play chess without substantial cognitive support, but remains in control of his side of the board and has a great deal of choice, which is unfortunately rare in the environment of an assisted living community. I learned that successful medical care for seniors must include opportunities for building sincere relationships, sharing treasured memories, and most importantly, preserving the ability to make choices in everyday settings. I mean, how
Mhm.
like that's incredible. And I again, this wasn't, this was this category for this experience was community service, volunteer, medical, clinical. you know I've discussed this over and over again with students who think that they have to have scribing experience to be remotely competitive for medical school. That so many of our successful applicants, their medical clinical experience is in a community service or volunteer setting.
Yeah.
So I don't know that he had any paid clinical experience. I don't think
I
he
don't think
did.
he did. He had
Yeah.
some like a little bit of shadowing,
Yeah.
exposure in
Yeah.
in that way, but
Yep.
not a ton. It was really more these educational things, the
Yeah.
research.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And then I also want to bring up, and we already talked about the one very significant research experience, but he additionally had more than 1,300 hours of another research experience as an undergraduate that he started at the beginning. And that had resulted also in publications and presentations. So, but it didn't make it to the most meaningfuls, right? So,
Right.
so here's a student who had two major clinically relevant research experiences. And so I think
Mhm.
that's important to note as well.
Right. And I'm sure, you got to start somewhere. So that first research experience set him up to get that really amazing second one.
Yep. Yeah.
And that's worth mentioning.
Yep. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, should we move on to the personal statement?
Yes, I just was going to make a quick comment about
Yeah.
that since our audience can't see it. It's not
Yeah.
maybe that exciting to listen to, but what
Yeah.
I really liked about his personal statement were these anchors at the start of each paragraph
Yes.
put us in time periods, and it just made it so crystal clear and easy to read.
Hmm.
So he would say, summer ends, sophomore year begins, and
Yes.
then junior year starts, and
I loved
then
that
I
too.
graduate. Like it
Yes.
was
And
so well
and it,
organized.
and it made it kind of rhythmic. So something
Yeah.
something that we
Mhm.
always tell our students is, look, you've got to orient your reader. Do not make your reader go back in time and figure out where you were, when you were, like how old you were, always orient your reader. And there's some people who think you have to sort of have this prose, and he did. He clearly had prose. I mean, he's an outstanding writer, but yet there was something sort of so simple about kind of
Simple. That's
how
the
he
word. Yeah.
organized his personal statement, and it worked for him. Like it totally worked. And what I also loved is he started his personal statement with a story about an experience that was a summer camp, um, which was an educational summer camp for young people with chronic illnesses. Again, didn't make it to the most meaningfuls, had just under 1,000 total hours with this experience, but yet he was able to work that story into his personal statement in a really meaningful way,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
I loved
Yes.
that. And it was sort of a story about, someone who, also, kind of had some limitations And, and I spent that summer organizing workshops about applying for jobs, understanding health insurance, and other topics to help campers take control of their lives. Several months later, I got a call from an excited Ralph. Applying what he had learned in the workshops, he had secured a job and was choosing his health insurance plan. I was thrilled, right? So,
Mhm.
he's integrating all of the, like, sort of the impact of all of these different experiences that he had. Not everyone necessarily has enough experiences to be able to do that. I would say most applicants, I think, Lori, end up touching on their most meaningfuls in their personal statement too, in some capacity. But again, so many different ways for this to work, right?
Correct. We get that question a lot. Can I have overlapping information between my most meaningful
Mm-hmm.
activities and my personal statement? And of course you can. I mean, you're
Yep.
telling your story in the personal statement, so
Yep.
it's okay
Yep.
to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And
So
then
she,
and yeah, and then let's and then the next paragraph, summer ends, sophomore year begins. Um and he talks about teaching, general chemistry. So this is
Mhm.
sort of like, again, this teaching theme. And then junior year starts, and then he talks about his academic interests. I enroll in a health and human rights law course to learn more about disparities through the lens of the healthcare and judicial systems. And then how that then led, to his research experience as an undergraduate. And then he also then talks about the prep program a little bit. And then he says, yes, I graduate the beginning of the next paragraph, and he talks about what he's doing, as a graduate. And then he sort of sums this up by, kind of alluding to and talking about the type of physician he wants to become. I want to become a physician who treats patients while addressing the psychosocial dimensions of health alongside the physical. So you can say all these things, but if you don't have the experiences to back it up, then it's there. The words are kind of empty. So, and he had the
Mhm.
experiences to back this up, certainly. So, an
Right.
outstanding application all the way around in terms of the written
It
application
was. It
itself.
was.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, let's talk about outcomes.
So what happened? Okay, so back to these late dates we keep harping on. But so he
Yeah.
finishes his secondaries end of September, and we
Mm.
had an exchange about the fact that he had finished them. And I said, okay, you can have a minute. And then he said 2 days later, well, my respite was brief because he already was offered an interview within a matter of 2 days.
Unbelievable.
I know.
Unbelievable.
And
Yeah.
again, for our listening audience, this is a little bit of an outlier situation. We like to talk about the outliers because they're interesting, but
Yeah.
for the vast majority of people, this is not how it
This
goes.
this is not real life. I mean,
Right.
yeah.
So again, like a message of optimism, and this makes it interesting listening, but you know,
This
to
is not the norm.
yeah.
This is not the norm. His application, and this is why I always talk about luck, right? With our students, with our applicants. So much of this is luck. Who just happens to be there, checking the inbox or like reviewing the applications, and who just happens to click on your application at at just the right time,
Yes,
so
yes.
and this is the case for any application process, right? It's not just medicine, it's anything.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he did incredibly well. So that first interview was in October, and he
Hmm.
did get 5 interviews before kind of that holiday break period. That it's I think we
Yeah.
think about like first half of the season, second half of the interview season. It's like
Yep.
before
Yep.
Christmas, the Christmas break, and after. So he was doing very, very well.
And
And
let's just talk about a little bit about what his results
sure.
were, like where he was getting interviews. So he got an interview at NYU Grossman, dream school. Where
Mhm.
else? Wash
He got
U,
an interview at Harvard,
Harvard, Yale,
Yale.
Mayo, UMass.
It was Mayo,
Um,
Arizona, just to
Mayo
be,
is, thank you,
specific,
Mayo,
but yes.
Arizona, and all of these were before the break, before
Mhm.
December. So unreal results, right? Just
Yes.
unreal.
Yes. Such a pleasant surprise for him
Oh,
and us. And
yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in my notes when we were practicing for his interviews, I said professional and articulate. And I mean, he was
Yep.
just beyond in both of those categories,
Yep. So
mature.
we
Um,
yeah. So what do we know? We know that his letters of recommendation were exceptional and that they captured, so many probably superlatives about him,
yes, yes.
because you don't get interviews like this unless your letters of recommendation are over the top. And I don't remember his exact letter writer portfolio. Let me just see if I can pull it up. And I'm wondering if he got
I
two
have it.
research letters.
I have it. It was two science professors, an
Mhm.
academic counselor, and two research
Yeah. So he had those two
supervisors,
research. Yeah.
PIs. So,
Yeah. Although what's interesting, it looks like, right, you can assign the research letters to different schools. So it looks like one of these research letters only went to one school. So that must have been the school where he worked. Let me just see where that was. So sometimes you can do that. So maybe he only sent that one research letter to that one medical school where he had done that research, is what it looks like. So
yeah,
what I suspect is that the 2 year research experience with the 4,000 plus hours must have just been
an
over the top
amazing letter.
exceptional. Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
again, something we talked about in the last case study is, how somebody navigates this process, how they work with us, says so much about how they're going to be perceived in the application process
Mhm.
itself. So we're always observing that too. And, he
Right.
also got interviews at UPenn, Perelman, Mount Sinai icon. So, he got in the end a
And Cornell
ton,
too.
and
He ended
Cornell
up
too.
with
Yes.
10 interviews.
Unbelievable.
Which again, this is an outlier. This
This
is
is an
not the norm.
outlier.
Um, the norm is three.
The
So
norm is three. And what do we say, right? What we say is if you have three interviews, we are so happy because
yep,
the odds are in your favor. That means, statistically speaking,
you
you
should
are getting into
matriculate.
you're
Yes.
yes, you're going to get into medical school most likely.
Yes.
I just want to let our listeners know, if you have any interest in working with MedEdits, please sign up for a free 15-minute consultation with a physician advisor. I will link that below. We would be happy to talk with you about your candidacy and how we can help you. Okay, let's
Yes.
move on. Do we
Yeah,
want
I
to talk
think
about some of his acceptances?
yes. I realized that I'm not sure I have the exact, I know he was accepted to at least three. It could have been
Yes.
more.
I
So
think it was probably more by the time we get to sort of the point in March, right? Where students have multiple acceptances. Usually at that point, we're only talking about the places that they're
they're over
seriously
us.
considering. That they're
Yes.
seriously considering. And but no, this is like such a kind student, right? I mean, he allowed us to review his application in a
So
public
kind. Yes.
forum, and we are so grateful for that. And so many students are going to learn so much. So thank you for sharing with everybody, with the world. But it looks like he definitely did get into Yale, Penn, and Harvard Medical School. And I don't know exactly all the results for the rest of all of the other schools, but certainly. Oh, and he also got into Mount Sinai. He got into Icon, so we know that. And so he right away just had some phenomenal choices for
He
a
did.
lot of students. Even students, and we've had this situation, they get into Harvard. It is very difficult for most people to turn down a Harvard acceptance. So even a student we worked with last year who got accepted to Harvard and got accepted somewhere else where they got a full ride, I think it was NYU, ended up turning down the Harvard acceptance because ultimately, look, free
Oh, because they got the full ride.
tuition, no
Right.
debt, is a
Smart.
better option than incurring a ton of debt, which is something
Yeah.
else that we always talk a lot about. But this student just had phenomenal over the top results.
So just two more quick points about him that I think would be interesting to
Yeah.
listeners. He was coordinating with a significant other throughout this process. So
Mm.
he was being very specific about locations.
Mm-hmm.
So that was another layer of sort of complexity.
Yeah.
That is the case for, I mean, it happens. You're coordinating with someone who's got a great job or is also trying to become a professional. And the other thing is, he did not get an acceptance until February 21st. So that's like
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
there's even someone like this who was getting
Yes.
these great interviews.
Yes.
It's still, you're still waiting, and
It's a
that can
waiting game.
be really tough. It's very
Yep.
tough. So
Yeah.
you have to stay calm and confident.
Yes,
It will
calm and
work out.
confident. And especially when you're aiming for the top, tippy top schools, because a lot of them release all their decisions in bulk in either late February or in March. So yeah, patience is always key in this process. And it's important till the bitter end, right? So like let's say you're someone who got 3 interviews, you're only on wait lists. Waitlists aren't going to start moving until May 1st. So, you've got to hold on till then. And every year we see waitlist movement and we see students getting into schools that where they were waitlisted, they didn't think they were going to get accepted to. So, patience is so vitally important in this process for everybody. So, if we kind
And
of
he
had to
did,
summarize, yeah,
and just
go
one
ahead.
last thing that
Yeah.
he did was he sent his updates. He had gotten a promotion at his job
Mm,
and I believe one more publication. And so he sent those updates to the schools where he had interviewed because he knew
mhm.
they weren't going to release decisions until much later, but he
Yes.
wanted them to have that information. So he stayed engaged, another very important piece of
Another
this.
very important point, and this is also something else that we observe, are students who are the most engaged with us throughout the process. This is what's going on with me. These are my updates. These are my accomplishments. And, are keeping in touch with us, are keeping in touch with their schools, especially for the schools, obviously, that allow those update letters, letters of intent, whatever communications you want to send. Those are the students who are going to do the best in the process because the process doesn't end when you submit the application. The process ends once you are accepted to a medical school where you're going to attend. Until then, you need to be building, you need to be improving, you need to be contributing, and you need to be staying engaged fully in the process. So, yeah, I agree with you. That's a really important point. So
I think
I
those were
think I
all.
think I think some takeaways here are look, every single applicant's path is different. Here we had a student very late in submitting their application, late in taking their MCAT, late in getting their secondaries done, and you know stays fully engaged in the process, despite all of that, and ends up matriculating at Harvard Medical School. So,
Yep,
that should, I hope that everyone learns a ton from this regardless of where you're aiming to go, you can learn from this student. So I thank you so
that's
much.
right. And be, just do the things you're interested in. Like he loved chess, he loved education, he loved
Mm-hmm.
teaching peers, he loved teaching older adults. So do
Yep.
the things you're interested in,
Mm-hmm.
and it will lead you to, where you want to be.
And figure out creative ways to apply those interests in your community,
Yes.
right? And to engage in those in your community. So, thank you all so much for tuning in. I encourage you to visit our Facebook page, follow us on Instagram, take a look at our website. And if you're interested in working with us, learning more about us, please sign up for a free consultation. Thank you so much.